Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Distress is Foretold, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Jeremiah, where we're going to be looking at the living signs of the coming judgment. So we'll see Jeremiah is going to be prohibited from marrying and having a family and taking part in other normal activities as a sign to make a stand against the coming judgment. So in Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 1 and 2, it says, "The word of the Lord also came to me, saying, You shall not take a wife, nor shall you have sons or daughters in this place." So since destruction and exile are soon to fall on Judah, the prophet must not have the function of being a husband and father. And God's kindness will keep him from anxiety over them in the awful situation of suffering and death. In an ancient Jewish culture, it would have been considered a shame and a dishonor to not be married with a family. And marriage and childbearing were expected as the cultural norm at this time. In verse 3 and 4, it says, "For thus says the Lord concerning the sons and daughters who were born in this place, and concerning their mothers who bore them, and their fathers who begot them in this land. They shall die gruesome deaths. They shall not be lamented, nor shall they be buried, but they shall be like refuse on the face of the earth. They shall be consumed by the sword and by the famine, and their corpses shall be meat for the birds of the heavens and the beasts of the earth." So we're going to see the reason for God's unusual command to Jeremiah. And the present time was so filled with distress and the coming crisis that it was wise for Jeremiah to not marry or have children. In verse 5 it says, "For thus says the Lord, do not enter the house of the mourning, nor go to lament or bemoan them. For I have taken away my peace from this people, says the Lord, loving kindness and mercies." So this was a home where friends prepared a meal for a bereaved family. And don't mourn over them or rejoice is what Jeremiah is told. And in the coming judgment, there was going to be so many who die that they wouldn't be buried properly. And it kind of reminds me, when I read this passage, it kind of reminds me of back in 2020 with COVID-19, when COVID was overwhelming the hospital systems, and there were actually, the death rate was, much higher on a daily than during your average, time. So funeral homes and hospital morgues and everything were getting overwhelmed. And even in my small little community area, they had morgue trucks that came in case if they needed to utilize them to store, dead people while funeral directives were taken care of. And God had taken away the peace from the people here. In verse 6 and 7 it says, "Both the great and the small shall die in this land. They shall not be buried, neither shall men lament for them, cut themselves, nor make themselves bald for them. Nor shall men break bread in the morning for them, to comfort them for the dead, nor shall men give them the cup of consolation to drink for their father or their mother." So cut and bald acts were indicators of extreme grief, but they were pagan practices that were forbidden through the Mosaic law back in Deuteronomy 14 verse 1. So people didn't, just shave their heads bald to try to hide the fact that they're getting old and gray, or, they were losing their hair. They would do it as a sign of extreme grief, but it was a pagan practice which was condemned by God. And such paganism had become so common in Judah that it must be specifically banned in this passage. In verse 8 and 9 it says, "Also you should not go into the house of feasting to sit with them to eat and drink. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will cause to cease from this place, before your eyes and in your days, the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. So after verse 2 and verse 5, there's yet a third symbolic prohibition that Jeremiah was also to detach himself from public celebrations, things out in the community. And when the judgment crisis came upon Judah, there would be no gladness or celebrations or weddings, any of that type of stuff. In verse 10 through 13 says, and it shall be when you show this people all these words, and they say to you, why has the Lord pronounced all this great disaster against us? Or what in our iniquity? What is our iniquity? Or what is our sin that we have committed against the Lord our God? Then you shall say to them, because your fathers have forsaken me, says the Lord, they have walked after other gods and have served them and worshipped them and have forsaken me and not kept my law. And you have done worse than your fathers, for behold, each one follows the dictates of his own evil heart, so that no one listens to me. Therefore I will cast you out of this land into a land that you do not know, neither you nor your fathers, and there shall you serve other gods day and night, where I will not show you favor. So Jeremiah was to explain the reason for the judgment, their forsaking of God and the worshiping of false gods. And they would get their fill of idols in Babylon. And God would send them into exile, as was called for cursing of disobedience back in Deuteronomy 28 verse 36 and Deuteronomy 28 verse 64. And the people who have served other gods in the land the Lord gave them will be made to serve these same gods in their homelands. In verse 14-15 says, therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that it shall no more be said, the Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel from the land of Egypt. But the Lord lives who brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north and from all the lands where he had driven them. For I will bring them back into their land, which I gave to their fathers. So in view of the Lord's promise of restoration from Babylon, the proof of God's redemptive power and faithfulness and the deliverance from Egypt would be to give way to a greater demonstration in the deliverance of his people from Babylon. And that bondage was to be so severe that deliverance from Babylon was a greater relief than that of the exodus of Egypt. And Egypt's deliverance was the central act of redemption of the Old Testament. And God constantly reminded Israel of his great work through the Passover celebration. In verse 16-17 says, behold, I will send for many fishermen, says the Lord, and they shall fish them, and afterward I will send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and every hill, and out of the whole of the rocks. For my eyes are on all their ways, they are not hidden from my face, nor is their iniquity hidden from my eyes. So, fishermen and hunters are references to the Babylonian soldiers who were doing God's judgment work. They were the instruments of God. And Judah is pictured as the prey of the Lord. And there would be no escape of the judgment, as also seen back in our study of Isaiah 2:19. And in verse 7, we see theology where God sees everything, that God is omniscient, and they would not escape the Lord's judgment no matter what they would attempt to do on their own. In verse 18 says, for first I will repay double for their iniquity and their sin, because they have defiled my land. They have filled my inheritance with the carcasses of their detestable and abominable idols. So the word for double signified full or complete, which was a fit and punishment for such severe sins. And Judah deeply defiled the Lord's land. Exile for a season was an appropriate response. in verse 19 through 21 to finish the chapter, says, O Lord, my strength and my fortress, my refuge, in the day of affliction the Gentiles shall come to you from the ends of the earth and say, surely our fathers have inherited lies, worthlessness, and unprofitable things. Will a man make gods for himself, which are not gods? Therefore, behold, I will this once cause them to know. I will cause them to know my hand and my might, and they shall know that my name is the Lord. So the result of God's judgment on the Jews will be the end of idolatry. Even some Gentiles, witnessing the severity, will renounce their idols. And after the return from Babylon, this was partially fulfilled as the Jews entirely and permanently renounced idols, and many Gentiles turned from their idols to Yahweh. However, the complete fulfillment will come in the final restoration of Israel. And knowing the Lord's name in verse 21 doesn't mean just knowing his name, Yahweh, or any of the other terms that you might hear in theology. But it means to recognize the Lord's authority and power through his acts of judgment. And while Judah's condition was gloom, Jeremiah still found strength and refuge in the Lord. So to wrap up tonight's video, we look tonight at Jeremiah's calling to live as a sign of the coming judgment. He was to live as a single bachelor with no children, which was looked down upon in society at that time period. And he's commanded not to take a wife or to father children. And in order for Jeremiah to fulfill God's call in his life, he needed to deny his desires to pursue a higher call. He had to deny himself. He had to deny his flesh. And I want to look at Luke chapter 9. Luke chapter 9, verse 23. And it says here, then he said to them all, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. So later on, Jesus taught a similar principle that as followers of his, we need to be able to deny ourselves. We need to take up our cross and follow him. And Jesus also preached to his followers that you must count the cost if you're going to follow me. And so as followers of Christ, there might be times that God calls us to give up legitimate pursuits that we might have for our own visions. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we're going to be reading a few parts of 1 Corinthians 7 here. So 1 Corinthians 7, verse 7 through 9 says, for I wish that all men were even as I am myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So the New Testament gives us specific honor and status to the unmarried, and it's telling them to regard their state as a calling of God, just like Jeremiah had the calling of God to remain as a bachelor without children. In today's society, I think that it's hyper be yourself. You don't need a spouse, you don't need children, all that. That is today's modern society's view as well. But if you're doing it, in devotion to the Lord and you have self-control, good for you if you're unmarried. All right. So God doesn't have a plan for everyone to have a spouse. And I want to look ahead in chapter 7, verse 26 through 35. And it says, I suppose that therefore that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do you not seek to be loosed? Are you loosed from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But even if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such will have trouble in the flesh, but I would spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time is short, so that from now on, even those who have wives should be as though they had none. Those who weep as though they did not weep. Those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice. Those who buy as though they did not possess. And those who use this world as not misusing it, for the form of this world is passing away. But I want you to be without care. He who is unmarried cares for the things of the Lord, how he might please the Lord. But he who is married cares about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. There is a difference between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman cares about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and in spirit. But she who is married cares about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. And this I say for your own profit, not that I may put a leash on you, but for what is proper, and that you may serve the Lord without distraction. So the Apostle Paul, in his writing to the Corinth church, advised contentment with the unmarried state, that they could find contentment in light of the present distress, but that they could also find light in knowing that they're carrying out the work of the Lord. And so Jeremiah chapter 16 verse 5 through 7, Jeremiah commanded not to mourn with others, not to be like a pagan. In verse 8 through 9, he was commanded not to feast with others. In verse 10 through 13, explains God's judgment of the people of Judah. Verse 14-15 is a wonderful promise of restoration once from exile. Verse 16 through 18, we see the zeal of God in pursuing the people ripe for judgment. And then we saw that the chapter ends with the Lord glorified among the Gentiles. So that's going to wrap up our study for today. And we'll see you next as we look at the foolishness of misplaced trust. And we're going to look at what we call the deceitful heart. And so I hope you have a great rest of your evening. I'll let you know when the next study will be. God bless.